Tony Faulkner is without doubt one of the world's best recording engineers. A Grammy winner, Tony has recorded well in excess of 3,500 of the best known and most admired classical musical performances. I'm proud to call Tony a mate and can honestly say he has been a big inspiration to me over the years. I admire Tony for his technical brilliance, his wit, his healthy skepticism, his true love of music as an art form, and of course a fascination and real understanding of the technology used to capture this art. I caught up with Tony in London, and here he shares his views on the industry he loves and has dedicated his career to. So Tony, thanks so much for coming over here today, and I apologise for bringing you to such a low-end place here in London.
Low end? No, I wouldn't say that. Wonderful suite here.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. I want to say I am a bit of an ignoramus with classical music. I mean, I love it. My father was really a fan. I remember him used to sort of play music and even stand conducting in the lounge room. He was really into it. But I don't have an understanding of a lot of the music. I do like it very, very much. But I find it an interesting thing in what you do in the recording side, where you are trying to, I believe, trying to capture the performance. Do you believe that's what you're trying to do? Capture the performance?
Yeah, we're not trying to create something out of bits and pieces. We're trying to reproduce what happens in a concert. I mean, it sounds very arrogant to say we're trying to reproduce it, but the problem is most people who buy a CD or download or whatever of classical music, they're trying to repeat an experience in their heads of what they've heard sitting in an audience. So if I produce something which is wildly different, then they're going to think, what the hell's going on here?
Sure.
So we've got that reference all the time.
Yeah, but it's. I mean, I'm sure you've never. The ultimate in classical music is the concert, sitting.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's right, and that's where I find it so different in modern contemporary music. The concert's terrible. I've never ever been to a live concert of contemporary music.
Well, the concert's usually trying to sound like the CD.
Yeah,
we're working the other way around.
And so that's a big subjective, like an effect thing. You can do whatever you like. Not that there's anything. I'm not taking away from the recording techniques, but that makes, for me, I think classical music recording then is the hardest, the most difficult to do of all the recording
Well, I
techniques.
think so, because you've got this reference back to what it really sounds like. The other thing is the amount of dynamic range, because if you go to a rock concert, you've certainly got the loud end, but it's not quiet very often. Once the music gets going, it's all in your face.
Yeah.
Where with classical music, the most exciting bit for me in the dynamic range isn't the really loud stuff. It's the really quiet stuff that can bring up the hairs on the back of your neck. And to try and reproduce that is an issue, because particularly with a huge symphony orchestra, when it's quiet, it is so quiet you can hardly hear it, and when it's loud, it's going to blow your brains out. How do you get that into Granny's front room, or how do you get that on the radio?
Yeah.
And that is an issue.
Very, very difficult, yeah. And you think it's, I mean, obviously there's always room to improve, and since recordings have been made, I remember reading once with an Edison thing, they used to advertise that you can't tell the difference between this and the real thing, you know, and I think maybe we're probably still somewhat like that, and you know.
Yeah, well, one of my friends has got a lovely 78 that RCA put out about recording, and it ends up, the last thing you hear is about the fidelity. Because they were so excited that it was so much better than anything they'd ever had before. But when you listen to it now, it's a bit of a laugh, really.
Yeah, but I wonder what it'll be. I think the process of recordings, I think it's the playback where we're going to have great advances.
Yes. I think the main problem at the moment, I hope I'm not just talking as an old git here, is just this necessity to interfere. We all feel that we have to interfere with what's natural. So if, for example, you're a photographer moving sideways as a metaphor, a photographer now spends 5 minutes taking the picture and 5 hours on Photoshop messing around with it.
Yeah, right.
And the same thing happens now with audio, that they seem to spend much more time just messing around with it. And with classical stuff, the more you mess around with it, the more obviously wrong it appears. It's a bit like too much green screen or too many sharp edges in a picture. You get the same with sound.
Yeah.
And once you deviate too far from the natural approach, I think with classical music especially, it just sounds wrong. It sounds incongruous.
So you then obviously would spend a lot of time prior to recording a concert. I'd imagine really listening to the room, and I mean, obviously, of all the experience that you've had, you're going to be pretty quick at doing it. But there must be a lot of, because if you walk into a room, you think this doesn't sound good. This is not going to be a good place. There's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, well, some concert halls you're stuck with how they are. It's a problem in London, especially if you've got a real mixture of largely inappropriate concert halls.
Yeah.
In terms of nice recorded sound, most of them are a bit too dry, or else they're incredibly bathroomy and huge. And you have to work on microphone techniques that either make it sound sweet when it isn't, or make it sound dry when it isn't.
Right. You have a degree in physics.
Yes.
And you also studied music. Did you get a degree in music as well?
No, I didn't. I wasn't allowed to.
Okay.
It was one of my, what's the word? Humiliating experience, I suppose.
Okay.
It's a slight exaggeration. I was at Guildford doing physics, and I wanted to change to the Tonmeister course. And they, after all the interviews and all the rest of it, because I hadn't got A-level in music, they said I was fundamentally unsuited to the music industry, which I didn't quite agree with at the time, and maybe I do now.
Yeah.
But it was fun.
Yeah.
And you can't do everything, and particularly 20 or 30 years ago, the schools were far less flexible than the universities. When I was at school, I did A-levels in French, German, Latin, maths, additional maths and physics. I couldn't have done music as well, because I'd already done too many. So I did music not really as a hobby. I used to play in the orchestra and used to sing in the choir.
What do you play?
Flute.
Okay.
But I wouldn't want to do it for a living.
Right, no, it's difficult.
Well, it's partly difficult, and also I think as a musician, when you're training to be a musician in an academy, this idea that you must immediately leap into some wonderful job and be principal flute in the Berlin Philharmonic within 5 years, otherwise you've failed. I didn't want to get in that rat race at all. And I've got lots of friends in the orchestras, and I get on terribly well with them, but I wouldn't really swap my job for theirs, because it's the range of music. I love all the different kinds of music I get to do.
Can you explain the Tonmeister courses? I think a lot of people listening to this wouldn't know what that was.
Well, the first ones were in Germany. I think it was in Detmold in North Germany. And it's a recognition that the record companies who used to train producers and engineers no longer do, in the same as the BBC's got rid of most of its training schemes. It's assumed that you go into these jobs already trained. So the universities saw an opportunity to offer a qualification for people who are musicians to learn enough about the technology to be good in the recording situation, or for technologists to learn enough about the music to be of use in the business. So a Tonmeister course, most of them I believe are like music degrees, only you do an extra year before the last year where you go and work in a studio for a year. So you get a job working at Abbey Road or at the BBC or something like that.
Right.
And they combine proper music theory. You have to learn an instrument as well. And then they combine that with learning enough technology about what sampling rates are and how microphones work. It's meant to give a proper all-round understanding. Because often in our business, because it's this strange interface between technology and music, you talk to an average musician, he assumes that the guy in the box knows all about the technology, and the technologists assume that he knows all about music, and there's a possibility he knows nothing about anything at all.
Yeah.
And he's just a bluffer. So the idea of the Tonmeister course was to try and get away from the bluffers and get people in there who've got a proper understanding of both.
So with having the physics degree and the music and the love of music, I mean, that's obviously helped you immensely in your career.
I'm glad I did the music side, because obviously I have to be able to read a score.
Sure.
I'm a fat lot of good if I'm trying to edit a Rachmaninoff symphony if I don't know which way up the score is.
Right.
I've got to have that understanding and a knowledge. And in a way, I was a bit disappointed when I didn't get on the course, but I've had some better teachers. I've had Sir Charles Mackerras teaching me everything I needed to know about Mozart, Colin Davis teaching me everything I needed to know about Berlioz and Sibelius.
Great professors.
These have been great professors, much higher standard than you would normally get in most colleges and universities.
So you're considered, a lot of people consider you as a maverick. I mean, does that sort of tag sit with you well, or?
I don't mind. I mean, the idea of a maverick, I looked it up in the dictionary because somebody called me that once. It's unmarked cattle on the wilds of the West. Yeah, I saw that. I think what they mean is that most of the time, if you're a recording engineer in my business, it will be assumed by musicians that either I work for the BBC, or I work for Abbey Road, or I work for Decca. Well, I didn't work for any of them, So I suppose that makes me a maverick.
Yeah.
But I'm very aware of what I think is my historical place, if that doesn't sound too grand. I know a lot of the pioneers, Chris Parker and Bob Gooch from EMI, who did the early stereo experiments at Kingsway with Beecham and people like that, and Ken Wilkinson at Decca. These were great pioneers. They weren't people who got multiple degrees in being tone masters. These were people who learnt it very much the hard way and the empirical way. So I don't know whether I'm a maverick or not. I'm not very good at being politically correct, but...
It's all part of your charm, though.
What will people like Sennheiser and Neumann have to say about RØDE? They would have an emotional response before they had a technical response in terms of looking at your product and thinking whether it's good or bad.
Sure.
They would immediately think you're a threat. And I think there are probably people who find me annoying because they probably think I'm either awkward or a threat. I don't consider myself awkward or a threat.
Right.
Just
Well, I consider myself awkward and a threat.
Jolly good.
So is there an establishment in the industry, you think? A group of people that's considered the establishment? Or is that mainly a UK thing?
I don't know. That's a difficult question to answer because there was much more of an establishment 20 years ago when Decca had probably 8 or 9 staff classical engineers. Abbey Road would have had at least 5 or 6. So if you were freelance, then you were somehow or other some kind of tart who hung around on the street with wearing black stockings. And they didn't really like freelancers. The only really active freelancer before my business got going was a guy called Bob Auger, very good English engineer. And he was freelance and he was regarded as some kind of maverick, but you couldn't wish to meet a nicer guy. And musicians certainly loved working with him because he was one of them. Musicians, my job isn't, although it's technical, it is primarily musical. I have to work with musicians and get the best out of them and stay out of the way when they need me to stay out of the way.
Sure. You were saying you're editing the music, but so what do you edit? What if you say if you're capturing it as a concert? What are you editing?
Well, say we're doing Bruckner's Fourth Symphony, which is a great long piece, about an hour. It starts off with a horn call, and if he splits the first note, what do? Do we scrap the whole concert? No, because the client is probably paying thousands, tens of thousands to record the concert. So the way around it is, because it's a public concert and there's an audience there, you can't say, hang on a minute, stop, we're going to go back to the beginning again. The concert finishes, and at the end of the concert, the orchestra comes back on the stage and they'll do the beginning again.
So you'll mark.
So you have to snip that bit in and out.
Yeah, kind of like ADR for film.
Yeah, I mean, a few little squeaks and things are part of the excitement of a concert.
Yeah.
But if there's a real howler, then you would have to do editing.
A bum note or something.
Yeah. As long as you don't get too manic about it. Otherwise, you're back in the Photoshop world I was talking about, where you don't allow people to have one eye higher than another. Or
so who makes that call, though?
The producer.
Right.
Often these days you don't have a producer and an engineer, it'll be me.
Right.
And it's usually liaising with the artists, because I'm their servant. And if Colin Davies comes up to me at the end of the concert and says it was wonderful apart from something or other, can we do it again? If he's volunteering to do it and the musicians want to do it, then the only alternative is to scrap recording, which would cause a lot of upset.
Sure. But at this stage of your career, obviously people trust you because they know you can deliver and they know you know. So if they go, how was it? I'm sure you
I've not let them down before.
No, absolutely. So when did you first use recording equipment and what was it?
Oh, well, my dad had a Telefunken KL65 little 5-inch reel-to-reel recorder, mono thing, when I was, I suppose, 8. And that was fun. And I used to record Top of the Pops on it and mess around with it. Then had a microphone and we messed around with it at home. But the first serious stuff I did was at university. I bought myself a Revox,
all right, which
Studio
one?
Sound Classifieds, G36.
Okay, that's a
valve
one. Yeah, they're beautiful. Yeah.
Lovely
Great.
machine. Just horribly heavy.
Yeah. I had an A77. That was.
That's before that,
60s,
I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I paid 45 quid for it and then spent 90 quid, I think it was, having new heads put on it.
A lot of money.
Yeah, but it was worth it. And I bought a couple of modest microphones, a couple of CALREC 1050s, which were considered modest then, and I presume considered as mavericks as well, because they were different from AKG and Neumann, who really dominated the market. I used to do lots of concerts, just plug the 2 mics into step-up transformers with a phantom power, well, half a dozen PP3s soldered together to make 48 volts. And straight in the back of the Revox, which had a high impedance input on the back. Some nice Gardner step-up transformers.
And where did you get your mic technique from then? You obviously just reading and...
I was influenced by Angus Mackenzie, who used to write a lot for Studio Sound,
Right.
and I used to like his stuff. But there's real problems with dogma in my business. There are people who are set in their ways about particular ways they want to work. There'll be somebody who says you've got to do it with a Soundfield mic, or you've got to do it with C24 set to cross figure of 8. Anything else you do is just disgusting.
That's a red rag for you, isn't it?
And there are other people who say you've got to give them a mic each,
Yeah.
so you've got absolute control in the box, and then you put acoustic round that electronically, and you've got complete control. I'm not really interested in either of those dogmas. Primarily what I'm interested in is a mic technique that doesn't get in the way of the music. And I know that sounds a bit like a sort of politician speak, but that's my job. I've got to provide a window onto the performers rather than have lots of fun myself twiddling knobs.
Sure.
And I don't really want to twiddle knobs. And I suppose maybe I'm lazy. Maybe it's my background. I quite like things to sound natural.
Sure.
So my main mic technique tends to be phased arrays. But still, if I pull the faders up and it sounds lovely, except I can't hear the glockenspiel, I will be naughty and I will put a microphone near the glockenspiel.
Right.
And I'll bring it up until I can hear it and then pull it back a bit.
Yeah, right.
So I can't be too dogmatic, otherwise the musicians will hate me. And with good reason.
You don't want that. Do you ever use any acoustic treatment?
Not normally. What do you mean in the...
Yeah, you might have a situation, you have some, I mean, I obviously can't get rid of big reflections that are problematic. Obviously, the venues that you record, the reflections are good, but...
Well, not always, no, because
No?
I get to work in funny places.
Okay.
In concert halls, normally I just take what I'm given. And if it works live in a concert for Beethoven Third Symphony and the Barbican, and I've got my mics behind the conductor's head and back a bit, and I can hear everything, I would leave it alone.
Right.
But, for example, last year we were recording in a church in Saint-Emilion in France, near Bordeaux. And the artists had chosen it because they'd done 2 concerts there, and they said it sounds lovely. Well, they were right, it sounds lovely, except when there's no audience there. And without an audience, it was 6.5-second reverb and sounded like the Taj Mahal. And we were recording 4 hands grand piano, which, I mean, it sounded lovely. It was like you'd had about 10 pints of beer or a bottle of wine. You couldn't hear any detail at all, but it sounded nice. So I thought, well, oh shit, what am I going to do? Well, I had some ribbon mics, and of course immediately the ribbon mics being figure of 8, by getting the angles right, I could get rid of the long reflection.
Right.
But then I asked the guys who'd rented us the piano, who had their own pop studio, and they brought the piano in from that. I said, have you got any screens? And they said, yep. And I said, well, can you stick them in the back of your van, bring them back here? And I put them behind the microphones, and that killed the reverb.
Made a big difference, yeah.
And I've been trying this instant vocal studio, so that if you're trying to record yourself in a bedroom which has got a nasty acoustic, you can put this screen up and it gets rid of the reflections off the back wall. And I have a feeling that could be very, very useful.
Sure.
Because particularly in Europe, you're often recording in places that weren't, well, anything like a studio. And that example's an obvious one. And I used to work a lot in SKYWALKER in California. And we had to do some harpsichord and violin in there. And whatever I did, even with the acoustic treatment, it still sounded a bit big and empty. Which, you know, it wasn't completely appropriate for the job. But we played around with screens there, and suddenly it just worked.
Violin's hard, isn't it?
It is, because
the
yeah, you
real
don't want it
critical.
to disappear up an Alp.
Yeah. Have you ever worked with Nigel Kennedy, for example?
Yeah.
So I love his stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Some of his Hendrix stuff is amazing too.
Oh no, he's off the wall. It's
Yeah,
great.
completely.
Very
He's a
exciting.
lovely man. But yeah, to record something, let's say he was doing Vivaldi or something, what would you do? What mic technique would you use?
Well, I've worked with Nigel, and he likes old valve microphones. So the last time I worked with him, I had an M269, I think.
Right.
And it was with an orchestra, so there was an overall pickup for everything. And you could hear quite a lot of him, but it wasn't quite focused enough. So I had this M269 up and just
Nice
brought
and
him up a
smooth.
bit.
Yeah.
The problem is a lot of modern mics can sound a bit fizzy and scratchy.
Yeah, that's why I was after. You know, that
That's sort of-
piano and violin. That's if you can
There's
get
sort of
them
minor
right.
bird noise, which I
Yeah.
don't like. I'm a bit of a ribbon freak as well.
Absolutely.
I don't like microphones that spit at me.
No, you don't want that. So you were the first to use digital recording for classical music as well, I believe.
First over here, I think, although the BBC may have done some internal experiments,
Right.
I started in 77.
Right.
Seems a horribly long time ago.
And what prompted you?
Laurie Fincham, I don't know if you know Laurie Fincham from the AES,
Right.
used to be a loudspeaker designer at KEF, and I was very active in the AES UK section. And he rang me up and said, "Tony, have you seen the AES journal?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, Sony are talking about bringing out a digital audio system. I think you should give them a buzz." And 3M were making a huge machine at the same time, big 32K reel-to-reel thing that you could never take on the road. Well, not without a Pantechnicon and 5 guys with brown coats. And I got onto Sony, and they flew something over for me, which I've still got in my garage.
All right.
I've got serial number 2 of a PCM1, and I think Stevie Wonder's got serial number 1.
History.
And that was 12-bit plus arranging bit, so 14-bit, no error correction, no CRC, and we were supposed to record on Betamax, but it was unreliable with dropouts, so I used to use U-matic. So I started in 77. Frightening, isn't it?
Yeah, but did you immediately say, I love it, or did you say things were lacking compared to analog, other than noise?
The immediate shock was just no noise, or minimal noise. And if you did 3 or 4 generations, you still had minimal noise. Where with analog tape, it can sound lovely first generation, second generation start getting a bit furry around the edges. And by the time it's gone off to be cut by some guy with a vinyl cutter, and he's EQ'd this and he's put his compressor in there, it's starting to sound less nice. Still for me, in fact somebody asked me this question 2 or 3 days ago on one of the blogs, still for me the best reproduction I've heard is my old A80 analog machine, 15 IPS, first generation in the control room. But, that's great, but what use is that to anybody else?
So why do you think that is?
I wish I knew, because I've tried all sorts of high resolution digital, this, that and the other. I used DSD, I've used 176K, we've done all sorts of sampling rates. There's still a generic hard sound, which is quite difficult to get round. The very earliest digital things tended to be probably a lot less linear, but sometimes they had a bit more energy than the latest ones do.
Right. There's a lot of research going into it, and I think if somebody can get it right, they will do very well. Everybody's looking for it. Obviously, nobody's going to go back to analog. We can't anymore with the editing.
It's to do with delivery as well.
Yeah.
We've got to deliver it. So even if I did record wonderful stuff on my A80, what do I do with it? People want to buy a CD of it, or they want to buy a SACD of it, whatever it is. It has to be digitized. And as soon as you do that, it's become something else. But that's tough.
Do you try and experiment to try and find out what it is?
Oh, yeah. Particularly earlier on, we did a lot of experiments, because when Hyperion started, the label, which was about 1980 odd, that was before compact disc. We'd had samples and we'd seen them, but they weren't a general product. These things still had to come out on LP. So we would record them digitally and then copy them to analog for editing, and then cut off the analog tapes.
Right.
And there were many occasions where subjectively I thought the analog copy sounded nicer than what I put into it, which is it's a very dangerous road to start going down.
Yeah.
What it is, I don't know. One thing, we did some experiments 5 years ago at Henry Wood, where we had a great pianist, a guy called John Lill, Moscow Prize winner, great stuff, doing Schumann, valve mics, a couple of ribbon mics as well at very low level. And we did live listening, tube desk, tube mic pre's, live listening, then off analog, then off 176K, then off 44K, then off DSD. And consistently, the nicest sound of all was off the A80. I even preferred it to the direct, which shows there's something wrong, isn't there, really?
Sure.
I think it changes the sound, but it's very benign what it does, and great.
Yeah.
Small amount of compression,
Yeah.
a little bit of woodling in the bass, which sounds nice. The roll-off is very smooth in the top. It's very benign.
And tubes?
I
You're a
love
real
tubes,
tube guy?
I'm a tube man. So
Yeah.
Still the best microphones for me for my orchestral stuff are the old M50s.
Yeah, right. They're pretty amazing. Absolutely.
It's the low end that it's very hard to reproduce with a modern small capsule mic.
Right.
The technology is still there to make them, but if they're going to cost you 8,000 quid each or whatever, you're not going to sell very many of them.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's always a solution to that.
Yeah, well, the remakes don't sound so good to me. They really don't. I know they've done various versions at Neumann of the M50. They all, for me, they just haven't got it.
Yeah, right.
It's very sad. What it is, I don't know. I think there's just this irresistible urge to improve.
Yeah.
And if you've got something that's very, got a 1922 Bentley, and this idea of improving it by putting a Ford Fiesta engine in it,
Sacrilege.
It is sacrilege.
What would WO say?
There's something wrong.
Yeah, yeah. I also heard you don't like SACD. Is that true, or you?
Well, I've got some doubts about it. I mean, I loved it to begin with because we needed a carrier that was better than CD. But of course, the market has pulled us in all sorts of different directions. There are problems with SACD. One of them, which I didn't discover until about a year after I started playing with it, is that it sounds very different according to what sort of power amps you use.
Right.
Because there's so much crap above 20 kilohertz coming out of the average SACD player that some amplifiers just sort of let off in steam, and other ones you start choking on themselves with slew rate problems. And if you remove the noise with the low-pass filter, by the time you've removed enough that you don't upset one of these esoteric solid-state amps, it doesn't sound much different from a CD.
Right.
And it's a sacrilegious thing to say as well, isn't it? I liked SACD as a carrier. It gives you surround and it gives you better quality. But as a practice, it's a very hard sell.
Yeah.
The manufacturing cost is high. The public's very confused.
It didn't seem to take off. So what equipment are you using now? What's your favourite rig? Or your only rig?
SADIE LRX. I'm
Right.
very happy with. I've been looking at the Tascam, I think it's called a 680. They do an 8-channel battery recorder,
Right.
which looks really fun for doing concerts where I'm doing sound for telly, where you have to mix it later because you're always having surprises.
So what do you like about it?
I like the sound of the SADIE, and I like the whole system is integrated in that while you're recording your concert or recording your sessions, you can do your mix because it's a hardware-based system, so you've got faders in front of you, which is lovely. I hate mixing with a mouse.
Yeah.
And it stores all those settings while you're going along.
Right.
And if you want to do a bit of editing while you're going through, you just cut this and cut that, save it. Then when I get home, I plug the hard drive into the desktop. All the settings are there.
Nice.
It's all ready to roll. And that includes things like Cedar for getting rid of noises and coughs and squeaks and trucks. It sounds very good. And it's got authoring on it for CD. It's got resampling, plugins, whatever you want to do, really. It's not cheap, but it's a nice package. It sounds good. And what I was using before was probably 10 times heavier and another 5 flight cases.
Yeah, right.
And with a lot of jobs these days, where, for example, I go off to Sweden for 2 days to record military bands, I don't really want to take 5 flight cases and drive there in a van if I can go there Ryanair or EasyJet and just walk on the plane with a
backpack.
I've still got my pyjamas and my razor in there. I've got the lot.
Sure.
And a few pencil mics, and I'm ready to roll.
What do you monitor with?
Quad electrostatics.
Okay.
That's another
the
maverick
gig, you
approach.
don't take the quads.
No, not if I'm on a job like that.
No.
I listen on headphones, and we normally rent a pair of horrible speakers from somebody.
Oh, but you will have monitors,
Yes.
studio monitors.
Yeah.
On,
Well,
okay.
A lot of my work, if you're doing classical, the artists want to come in and listen. Even if it's a concert, you'll record the dress rehearsal,
Right.
and the conductor will come up and listen.
So where do you locate yourself, though? You can't be in the...
Well, it's why my company's called Green Room Productions, because
Right.
I work in a green room usually, which is where the artists go to powder their nose and to meet their visitors after a concert. So I sit backstage at the other end of a long multi-way. Depends where I'm working and what I'm doing. A lot of the TV stuff I do, I'll be sitting in a chair store or underneath the stage, or a couple of times in the front row of the audience,
Right.
around the side.
Okay. And mic techniques, I really want to talk to you about that. So we've got the Faulkner phased array.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah. Can you explain how that works and how you came up with that?
Well, there are 2 basic philosophies about recording tech. Well, 3 actually. One of them is to use as many mics as you like and mess around with it afterwards to create something artificial, but where you've got complete control. Then there are the 2 techniques of more purist start, if you like. One of them's the European one, based on 2 microphones fairly close to each other, maybe not absolutely coincident, but not far apart. Or the American technique of having 2 spaced omnis, or maybe 3 spaced omnis, because if you have 2 of them, sometimes there's a hole in the middle. Because I'm European, my background is to go to a more coincident style technique. But the problem is it's very limited once you're in the real world of trying to record the planets in the Barbican with the LSO, you can't be quite so dogmatic, because if you stick up your crossed coincident pair, pull the faders up, it really doesn't sound very nice, which is a bad start. And if the artists come in and say, ugh, then you really have got a problem.
Absolutely.
So I've been working on techniques very similar to the way the French developed ORTF, where the mics are spaced a bit. And you start off in a way empirically, but it definitely, there are certain golden spacings, if you like, with particular mics that work very well. And I've been using phased arrays for years, which really, I just used to doodle with microphones and have a listen on headphones, see what it sounded like when I was working on my mic techniques. And early on, I had to do a lot of work in a big church called St. Jude's on the Hill in Hampstead. Well, it's massive. It's a beautiful acoustic. I mean, it sounds like you imagine a great cathedral in Venice would sound. Well, that's great if you're recording music that will be recorded in a great cathedral in Venice. But if you're trying to record soprano and violin, you don't really want it to sound quite so big. Well, figure of eight's a very nice way to get rid of some of that huge acoustic. So I tried, instead of using cross figure of eights like this, I tried various spacings. Suddenly, the image was beautiful, and when you looked at where the microphones were, and then you listened to it, you thought, well, hang on a minute, the microphones sound about 10 foot closer than they actually are.
Nice.
Well, that gives you certain advantage, because if you've got a group that's blending in the acoustic when you go out there and listen to it, when you go in the control room, it's still blended, but it's drier in a way which is more commercial. So this technique started off with 2 figure of eights, and then I started working on different techniques for big orchestra, because figure of eights, particularly capacitor mics, like say the Schups MK8, they're like a bandpass filter. There's nothing below 100 Hz and there's nothing above 10K. You can try and EQ it a bit, but still it doesn't sound like a big orchestra, because you've lost a couple of octaves of the bottom end.
Right.
It makes the orchestra sound small and a bit like it's coming off a transistor radio. So I thought, I've got to come up with something a bit better than this. And I was using quite a lot of jobs with a couple of omnis about, I suppose, 66, 67 centimetres apart. That's a sort of golden spacing which works. And one day I was working in the Barbican with Richard Hickox, God rest his soul. He was at Sydney Opera. We were doing Hansel and Gretel.
Right.
And I got it all set up. It's a live concert. I had some choir mics up, I had a soloist mic up, and I had a 4 mic rig up for the front of the orchestra. And all set up for the dress rehearsal. 2 minutes before the dress rehearsal starts, Richard says, I can't see and nobody can see me. I've got to move. So they said, we'll have to take the first row of seats off sale in the concert. And they moved his podium back. Well, moving his podium back meant I couldn't put a stand up. So I was stuffed. And I worked on this funny technique of a stand either side of the podium with booms across from the mic stands, and I put a couple of MK21s in the middle because I thought it might be too wet, and I put a couple of omnis on the outside because I thought it might be too dry, and I thought, well, I'll sort it out upstairs.
You fix it later, yeah.
And it sounded lovely.
Right.
And I have to thank Richard Hickox for that.
The mother of invention.
Yep. And then I worked out how to do that on a single bar. So I have a bar that's 67 centimetres wide. I put a couple of omnis on the outside, a couple of directionals on the inside, ORTF, and then sit in the box and pick a mix. But because it's a phased array, because all the mics are aligned in time, when you add them together, you get forward gain, a bit like you do with aerials,
Right.
with line source loudspeakers. And that forward gain is quite useful, because it means you can get the microphones a bit further out of the way. And I find a lot of orchestral things I can do with just this one setup over the conductor's head.
Is this published anywhere?
This particular one, no. It was mentioned in the Resolution
Right.
article I did with George Schilling. But the problem is, it's another area where I suppose you might consider, you called me a maverick earlier. It is maverick in the sense that a theoretician, like one of the guys who writes these long AES papers full of differential equations, would look at this 4 mic rig and think, oh my God, what's going on there? Because it isn't purist in a way that makes the maths very easy. If the mics were coincident, all the mathematics suddenly work. But the problem is, it doesn't sound very nice. So I came up with a solution which means not using many mics, having a natural balance, but breaks one set of rules, but avoids the other alternative, which is typically 50 microphones
Yeah.
dotted around an orchestra. And 50 microphones dotted around an orchestra, first of all, in my opinion, doesn't sound very nice. And it's also a huge mess. If I've paid 35 quid to go to a concert, I don't want to sit there looking at 57 microphones and cables and wires. And some artists, particularly older artists, if a conductor's got to walk off and walk on at the end of the concert, if he's got to walk past 57 microphones, he's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And there was a very big standoff years ago with ANDRÉ PREVIN, the Festival Hall, where he was doing a concert and they put gazillions of microphones out for the broadcast. And he said, well, I'm sorry, I can't do the concert. There's no way I can risk, because his legs are a bit dodgy. He's an older man now. He said, I can't get to the podium and back without risking falling over or tripping over something. This is absurd. This is a concert, not a recording session. So I tried to make a technique which is more transparent and out of the way.
And this is where the art and science thing comes into it. And, you know, anybody who wants to start analysing technically what you just said, you're pulling the sound, and that's what it's all about. It's like trying to analyse why a great wine is a great wine. Of course, you can do all the chemistry with it, but at the end, there's a lot of...
But that's an interesting analogy with wine, because I mean, I'm very interested in wine. I mean, not just drinking it, from
I'm
a
with you there.
scientific point of view.
Right.
That it's very easy for people to become great experts on wine. They read a magazine, they read a blog, and they say, well, if it isn't Chateau Petrus 1961, it's not worth drinking. Where if you're a real wine enthusiast, you'll try all sorts of things, not just because you want to get plastered, but because you like the variety and you just like the different things about doing things different ways. And in my businesses, a lot of people can be real snobs about microphones, and they have to insist, oh, well, if it isn't an M50 with the original 701K and the original aluminum capsule, you can't possibly use it.
Made of unobtainium.
Well, come on, give us a break.
Yeah.
There's lots of different ways to do it, and that's what makes my job interesting, and that's why I have different techniques, because if I did it always the same way, I get very bored.
Yeah, but that's why I so admire you, because you don't hide behind that sort of stuff. You're open. You're willing to teach. You say there's no magic. Of course, to reproduce what you do is you make it look easy, is what I'm trying to say. But you don't hide behind something, because you are confident, because you do know what you're talking about.
Well, I've done it quite a lot now.
Yeah.
Some people say too much.
Yeah.
But I've been out and about. I enjoy it. It's fun going. I'm going out to Russia next week.
Yeah, St. Petersburg.
Yeah. Go out to another orchestra to notch up on my bedpost, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. Other miking techniques. Have you ever used MS? Do you like MS?
I don't like MS terribly much. The only time I've ever used it is when I'm stuck that I've got to have a solo mic, and I don't like a solo mic that sort of ends up in my face in mono. To have an S component there just to widen it is good. And if you used a couple of mics like that, if you've got a singer who moves around, then it doesn't sound quite right.
Yeah.
But I'm not a great coincident person, apart from cross figure of eights. So they don't really work for me, but they work for other people. I don't mind other people doing it.
Sure. Soundfield?
I had a bad experience early on because they were a lot less reliable than they are now.
Right.
I didn't like it very much. I'm not a great fan, really. I have a sort of allergy to absolute pure coincident techniques. I like a little bit of spacing that somehow or other gives you an ambience and a presence as well. And most musicians quite like that. And the word presence to an engineer normally means EQ at a certain frequency. But to a musician, it means they want to be closer, but they also want the feeling of ambience around them.
Yeah.
It's that combination. And if you use a phased array type technique, it's a lot easier to get that impression of presence and the acoustic being around the sound.
I also believe you're not a real fan of 5.1 for music.
I'm not.
Right.
I think 5.1 was great for what it was designed for. You know, if you Bruce Willis shouting and there's helicopters flying all over the place, 5.1 is fantastic.
Isn't it just the implementation though? Surely if you could try, obviously you're trying to make it to reproduce that experience. And let's say we set up an amazing studio monitor system and you were in the best point, and then you did mix or you actually recorded in 5.1. Maybe I'd be immersed, I'm back in the concert hall.
Well, I mean, the issue, let's go through the first one, the point one. The boom box. The boombox is primarily, I think, for things like Apocalypse Now, when the helicopters fly over and the bombs start dropping. It's essential to have something that moves air.
Yeah.
If I'm doing violin and piano, what is going to come out of that, apart from maybe a bit of traffic noise and some rumbles? It's not really what I want to hear.
So maybe not 5.1 then, surround.
Well, so we've already got to 5.0.
Right.
I would prefer 4.0, really, for a couple of practical reasons. First of all, the centre speaker is very variable from system to system with people's home systems. For example, if I pop down the road to Dixon's and buy myself a new LG LED monitor and I buy a package, I'll get 2 nice hi-fi speakers on either side. I'll get 2 satellite speakers at the back, which are sort of nice but got no bass. I'll get a boom box, which you hide somewhere or other, and I'll get a squawk box in the middle, which is meant for dialogue when you're watching movies. Well, if I've got Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, do I really want the violin coming out of this centre speaker? If it's a system where I've got 5 fantastic P&Ws, then maybe I can, in the mix down, I can make that work.
Right.
But if it's played back on a system which has got a talkback speaker in the middle, which is what most of them have, this horrible sort of thing that sounds like that, I don't ever want anything to come out of that.
No, so it's more about the way what people have at the moment.
No, I love surround. I've been doing surround since I was a student. I mean, that's a long, long time ago. I worked on surround sound in 1969, 1970, when we were doing with height recordings, mainly in Oxford. We did some stuff in London at Alexandra Palace, and played back on the right system. Absolutely amazing.
And that's what I've done. I've set up like with our Opal monitors. Forget subs. I don't use them. So and I have all the same speaker, and I don't need subs. And I tell you, it's special.
It is, and it's not just to do with ambience. It's the whole thing. We did. I mean, one of the first recordings we did was with an amateur orchestra in Oxford Town Hall of Petrushka. And I just got this array. It was a weird-looking thing. It had 4 CALRECs in a tetrahedron, forward pair stereo like that, and another pair at the back going up and down.
Right.
And we played it back because I was still living at home. I was still a sort of gearslut's annoying teenager.
Right.
We played it back at home, and I put the upper speaker up on my dad's step ladder in the lounge, and another speaker on the floor down the bottom. And the first time we played it, I'd never heard bassoons sound so real. And it wasn't because there was any more bandwidth that appeared from anywhere, but it was just a convincing sound. It didn't just go, it really sounded like a bassoon. And there were other effects which didn't quite work, like the microphones were above the audience, so if anybody had a sweep wrapper or turned the program, it was underneath you, which was a very strange experience. But the actual sound of the orchestra was extraordinary. The strings sounded big. You could hear all the back of the orchestra without microphones. Lovely.
So would you like to experiment more with that, with the surround now?
I'd like to, and I wish there were more
opportunities.
I mean, with carriers, there are more opportunities now. There's no reason why you can't have a 4-channel uncompressed FLAC file. But in practice, I think we've all got a little bit... Well, certainly the audio industry's got very blown out by surround because several companies went bust in the 70s. People like Sansui and JVC, because CD4 and SQ just didn't make the money. QS, sorry, the Sansui one was. And they were matrix systems, so they were very flawed. And then we had another shop with DVD audio, which disappeared. And then with SACD, which hasn't been a huge commercial success. It's difficult to know where surround is going apart from in video.
Yeah.
And I'd love it to come back because it does sound very exciting. I think it's more significant than doubling the sampling rate. You get a lot more information for your money. Right. Maybe it'll come.
You can spearhead the way.
Yeah, I mean, Dolby works, doesn't it? Works for me. I wish somebody could make a nice microphone that had Dolby encoding in it.
Right. Why would you want that?
Well, because then I could go out on the road with my camera.
For less gear.
And I could plug in my wonderful new Dolby surround mic in the front.
Yeah, right.
And come home and have surround encoded master.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of the video cams are coming out with a little the Dolby processing inbuilt in them as well.
Well, the new Sony cameras have got, like the PMW 350, it's got 4 channels of audio.
Yeah. So
you can at least record it and then encode it when you get home.
I haven't heard them. You heard them?
Yeah.
They're good?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay.
So I would only normally use 4 channels for surround.
Right.
I love surround. Yeah.
When would you pick a small capsule mic over a large? Where would you, what are the uses for you? When do you sort of go for a large capsule, or when do you go for a small?
Well, most of the time I use small capsules, because even the M50, which is, is a huge bomb of a microphone, inside there it's only like a KM83 capsule in there, or KK53. I would normally use large capsule mics if I want something like a K2 I want to use on a timp or on harps or on a vocalist that really needs beefing up in a big way.
MP3.
Yep.
What are your thoughts?
Bit sad, really.
Right.
I think when it came out, it was a obvious technical response to a need for small file size for moving stuff around, a bit like JPEG for pictures. So long as the compression rate isn't too high, they're a very, very useful tool, an MP3. But I think we've now got a generation of people listening to stuff that really isn't as clean as it ought to have been, and not as clean as it was before it was MP3'd. And the need for it now is a lot less.
Right.
We've got so much bandwidth.
Yeah.
I mean,
And also so much
my daughter's
storage.
walking around with an iPod in her pocket that's got 8 gigs of memory in it.
Yeah.
She doesn't really need her album to be down to 10 megs to squeeze it on or make it an attachment for an email.
Yeah, that's what Alan Parsons was saying when I talked to him recently. He's saying, it's just people automatically do it, but it's sacrilege. You have the storage capability.
You do.
Why on earth would you go?
If you've got a really nice still that you've shot with a wonderful camera, why would you want to JPEG it down to the smallest thing?
Yeah,
and then expand it back out, and then you look at all the edges and the shadows, and they're all rubbish.
Yeah.
I think MP3, I think we've been sold a pub. I must say. And a lot of people making a lot of money out of it. But if you use good microphones and you put them stuff up properly and you're working with good musicians, why would you want to screw it up like that?
Yes.
And people say you can't hear it. Well, I'm not convinced by that argument at all. There's all sorts of other horrible metaphors one can think of, and I wouldn't want to say on a show like this.
A family show, yeah.
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 But it's known as pee in the soup syndrome. That if you've got this idea that if you pee in the soup, nobody notices, and how much you keep on peeing in the soup until somebody does notice it, the answer is you don't pee in the soup.
Yeah. I'm never going to go to dinner at your place.
And I do think with MP3, the whole thing has been about how much can you get away with before anybody notices. And how do you define when people start noticing? The answer is you just try and do it the best possible way you can. And MP3 is about cutting corners and making largely a pretty horrible noise. And with classics, where there is such a big dynamic range and a broader bandwidth, to prejudice a sound because it happens to work on a Britney Spears single from 5 years ago isn't the same as it working for the Damnation of Faust. And I don't want things to be tailored around that one particular end of the market just to satisfy another end of the market. It's wrong.
Yeah.
We don't need it.
Well, it's like we were talking before, the differences in what you do and what the contemporary music industry is about. And obviously you see so many people walking around. Their main music monitoring is through earbuds and iPod. That's the millions and millions of people. Whereas your customers, they're usually sitting, listening in the sweet spot with some good speakers, and it's critical listening, and it's a totally different thing.
But there are still people in the contemporary business who are very, very picky about sound.
Oh, I'm not saying that for 1 minute.
Absolutely manic about it, and they would be very upset, I'm sure. I could line up 2 or 3 engineers on the rock side that would... they would like to meet the MP3 people and hang them from the nearest tree.
Absolutely. But the majority of their consumers are what I said. And so there's not the drive. I don't think you could get away with, not that you'd want to, producing something like that. Everybody, all the people who buy these incredible recordings, classical music recordings that you do, they won't accept it.
Well, I hope not.
No, not at all. And that's what...
Unless they want it for jogging, and then you're prepared to accept the downgrading because you want the convenience of listening to your Beethoven while you're jogging.
Yeah.
But I don't think everything should be tailored down to that.
Yeah. So you have more than 3,000 titles to your name.
Sad, isn't it?
But I think it's amazing. Do you keep track of them? Do you have every single one of them?
No.
Right.
No, I'm a bit like a farmer. I don't keep lamb chops.
A little notch on the side of you.
No, I mean, I've got very fond memories of some of them.
Yeah.
And some of them have sold prodigiously.
Yeah.
And often the ones done under a lot of pressure, because nearly everything I've done up until certainly 5 years ago, straight to twin track. None of this stuff is spending 3 weeks mixing it. You do it on the night, and If it sounds too wet, somebody puts a bit of echo on it, or if it sounds bass light, somebody puts a bit of bass on.
Yeah.
But there's none of this endless meddling. I enjoy
right
that.
up front.
Yeah, and some of them have sold extraordinary. We did a Goretzky record for None Such, which was targeted to sell 1,800 copies, and it sold more than 4 million.
Wow.
And that was done with very simple mic technique, straight to stereo. The Hildegard thing we did for Hyperion, which is a wonderful story, is a small English label was approached by a early music group, Medieval Singers, saying we'd like you to do a nice recording of some medieval French songs. And Ted thought, well, that'd be nice. And they got the cassette from a radio broadcast, and Ted put it in his car player upside down by mistake. And on the other side was some 11th century German polyphony by a composer called Hildegard of Bingen. And everybody liked it. Thought, well, that's fun. Got played on the radio, on Radio 2, and they had thousands of telephone calls about it. And it sold more than 100,000 copies.
Wow.
And that, again, that was just two
story.
mics.
Yeah.
Really simple. Or two phased array. And we had a couple of ambience mics because some of the tracks sounded a little bit too dry. But very, very simple.
You're a Grammy winner.
A few of those, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does that mean to you? Do awards, obviously, I mean, they're satisfying, but you just said it a minute ago, but the best award is having lots and lots of people want to buy the recording and enjoy it.
I think that's more important, really. You just get on with it. I've had to deal a lot with critics, the same as you have to with your microphones. You're very happy when they like it, and when they don't like it, you don't take any notice. You have to...
You don't take any notice? I get really upset.
Well, I've got upset. I used to get more upset. I don't bother now.
Yeah.
I get on pretty well with the critics, having said that.
Yeah.
Very well indeed. And mainly because I don't go after them.
Yeah.
If they thought that I was going to be an awkward bugger all the time,
Yeah.
they would probably be nastier to me to try and wind me up.
Yeah, I find the same thing. It gets easier as you more
But awards,
established.
a lot of it's to do with... Often they award something that's already successful. When we did that, the record I was talking about, the Goretzky, it was originally reviewed in the Gramophone, and the Gramophone said, there's no point in buying this record. And then they gave it a Gramophone award 6 months later. So they had to reflect the fact that it was popular with their readers and that it had done well.
Okay.
So suddenly it was better.
Yeah, right.
And it was actually the same. So I don't take it too seriously. I will say with my students, I've had various students along the way.
Right.
You have to be your own critic.
Sure.
That's much more important. The same as you with your microphones.
Yeah.
You've got to know you're doing the best you can without listening to every Tom, Dick and Harry who says, well, it's a bit too bright, a bit too dark, a bit too shiny.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever been tempted to get involved in contemporary music? A little bit of gangster rap or maybe punk in its heyday?
I've never been asked.
Okay, but would you? Would you be interested? I mean, I think you
go
do.
with anything.
Yeah.
The only problem is that over all these years, 'cause I've been doing it so long, I'm used to a life of spending 3 days making a recording. This is without an audience, without a concert.
Sure.
Spending 2 or 3 days doing it, and then 2 or 3 days editing it, then it's gone. The problem with rock is that they'll, certainly how it used to be done, presumably still is now,
It's a long process.
they'll spend a week mucking around with the drum sound. Well, I would be so bored. I would, I just couldn't cope with it.
Yeah, some of the people that I know who are involved in that area, they don't do that. They have great setups, but they do take a long time in the.
I like the spontaneity of a performance. That's why I'm happiest with classical and with jazz, because you really are eavesdropping on a real event.
Yeah.
And they may be doing a little bit of touch-up with makeup, but you're not actually getting in there with a knife.
Well, you're capturing a live event each time. Do you ever do any recordings where it's in a big studio?
I worked in Abbey Road a lot, I was in Abbey Road in January. That was lovely. Had a great time there.
That's a totally different thing though, isn't it?
Yes. Well, that's one of the last great studios left, in my opinion, because it's got such a live sound with an orchestra. You just put the mics up there and it sounds nice. And when we were in there in January, we did a violin concerto, and the concertmaster of the orchestra came in, Carmine LSO, and we were listening to this, that and the other, and he said, Tony, he said, can you play that with the reverb turned off? Because he wanted to hear a bit more detail. And I said, well, no, because I haven't got any reverb turned on.
Yeah, right.
That's the hall.
Yeah.
And it was lovely. It had this lovely big ring, and when they played quietly, the orchestra really purred in this environment. And when they played loud, it was huge and it was wonderful. And the composer had never heard this music other than as MADI files, or MIDI files. For him to hear the LSO going through his own stuff in that environment, in that studio, was breathtaking. It was wonderful.
You should have tried it. Go, how's that? That's perfect. I used to do it when I was live mixing and was told to turn it down. Sure, man. How's that?
No, well, we're all used to things like that. I've had the opportunity to work with some of the great old engineers, Ken Wilkinson from Decca, because when he retired from Decca, there were still people who liked working with him, and Reader's Digest used to use him, and I did sessions with Reader's Digest after Ken had retired, and we were in Watford doing Verdi highlights for Reader's Digest with a huge orchestra and choir and all the rest of it. We went off for dinner afterwards, and I was talking to him, asking him a few tips, and I said, well, what do you do when you're in the control room and people come in and say, can you do this, can you do that, I want to hear more violas, I want less glockenspiel. And I said, well, if you know not that you've got it perfect, but anything you do is going to make it worse, what do you do? And he said, well, two things. He said, first of all, one of them is you can try turning the monitoring up, and the other one is go out in the hall and play with the closed circuit camera and come back in again. And I think that's the two pieces of good advice.
Good, absolutely good advice.
If you know you can only make it worse, you leave it alone.
Yeah. Be confident to do it. Yeah. So, can you tell me about any major catastrophes you've had on a gig?
Well, the most exciting one was London Symphony Orchestra, MARISS Jansons, Mahler Sixth Symphony in the Barbican live. Artist comes in at the end of the concert saying, can I have a listen? 6-channel SACD or DSD. And the recording had gone on, the countdown said how many minutes were left on the hard drive, the red lights were on, meters going up and down. Press playback, nothing on the discs.
Oh.
Yeah.
What do you
but
do?
One thing you tend to be in my business is, you have to survive, is to be an old woman. And I had a Tascam 2424 in the background, and I had a CD burner, and I had 2 DAT machines. So we were covered.
Oh, you had a backup. I was going to ask
but not a
you
DSD backup.
No,
Didn't have a
right.
DSD backup. But that was a very hollow moment when the conductor's sitting there and you press the play button and nothing comes out. That's not a very nice feeling.
Not good. Yeah, that'd be horrific.
I've had very few disasters, mainly because of this old... I say I'm an old git when it comes to things like backups.
Yeah.
We always, if we're doing a concert, there's always 3 systems running.
That was one of my things I was going to ask you. You'd have to do. I mean, I learned early on. I haven't done a lot of recording, but I remember being taught you record everything, especially in a contemporary music situation when they're jamming, and all of a sudden they go, "That was great. That was the one."
You've got to get it. And they say,
"Oh."
"Turn off the red light." That's when you don't turn off the red light, because that's the one time they get it right.
They get it right.
And now, particularly, I mean, in analog days, you got half an hour on a reel of tape, so that was a pain in the neck. You're always changing reels.
And expensive.
But these days, you go down. Well, I pop down to PC World and buy a terabyte drive for 60 quid or whatever.
They're amazing.
And you just keep the lot. I can't think of any other huge disasters.
Right. Well, that's good.
We've had sort of personality crises, not with me,
Right.
but with other people getting cross.
Yeah.
But normally I try and stay out of that way. Tend to be artistic crises over a conductor who doesn't get on with the singer.
Right. I was going to say any sort of prima donna.
Oh yeah, no,
conductors?
we've had people storming out.
Really?
Not normally conductors.
Pretty good.
It's quite often, it can be singers.
Right.
Because I mean, it's a very sensitive thing being a singer. This is your instrument is your voice,
Sure.
and it can be off form, or you can just have a problem, and you take it very personally if somebody has a go at you or you feel it isn't going well.
So, what excites you about the future?
Oh, well, I think there's plenty to be excited about, because you have to make the best of what's happening, and what's happening in the music business in the UK is that retail is having a lot of problems. The stores aren't covering their costs because they used to make lots of their money selling games, selling videos, selling whatever, not just classical. Classical's a small part. But when those shops cease to be profitable, it removes the natural way in which labels expect to market their product. So there's been a trend over to the internet and to mail order, so that people buy their CDs mail order, or order them from Amazon, or they get downloads. I think there's a big future for high quality downloads, and the audiophiles are going to have to get used to it, because so far they've been sort of surviving with their vinyl and digging out Elvis Presley and Boston Pops from the 1950s and 60s. there's a limited interest in that because music is about living artists, living composers, living events and concerts that are going on. So I think with time, the download market will mature a lot into stuff that's more interesting.
Right.
And there's so much more happening now with artists. A lot of the work I do is direct for artists. It's not for labels anymore. You'll get a call from a pianist or from a singer, and they'll say, well, I'm doing a concert at the Wigmore, can you come along and record it? We want video as well, because they need video as part of the marketing package. They want PDFs of pictures and the text to replace the booklet. In a way, we've been in limbo for the last 4 or 5 years, just getting used to the concept of electronic delivery. And until recently, that's just been a sort of cheap way to get a duff version of it to play on your mobile phone. We've got to let that mature into something better. And it will happen.
Yeah.
And it is happening already, because apart from anything else, there's a big drive to make video downloadable. And if you've got a system that can do that, the amount of bandwidth we need for audio is considerably less. And that's going to work, and it is working.
So the delivery mechanism, that's the thing that's really exciting for you.
That's what excites me, yeah, because it can sound really good. And, I mean, it is always depressing that you, particularly with analog, I mean, whatever you do with it, it always sounds worse when it's gone away from the control room. But even with digital, often it can sound lovely in the control room. Then you get the CD and play it in the kitchen. You think, well, I don't remember it sounding quite like that. And you find somebody's mastered it and taken all the bass off or put a bit of lexicon or something like that. With a good quality download, you don't need to do any of that messing about. It can be transparent again.
Well, it was very, very inspiring, and I thank you so much for your time. I want to rush out and start recording some music, and I'm going to try some of the new techniques that I've learnt from you as well. So thank you so much, Tony.
I really enjoyed that interview with Tony, and I hope you did too. If you'd like to listen to one of his recordings, there's a link at the bottom of this page which takes you to his site. There you'll find a comprehensive and varied choice of music from which to select. Next week I'm off to LA to speak to some really interesting people from our industry, and I look forward to presenting the first of these to you in the next exciting edition of Interview with a Legend here on RØDE TV.